Okay. Good evening, everybody. Maybe there's some more people coming up, but we're going to start a little slow so people can join us in a few minutes. But essentially, we're going to talk tonight about compost and composting in your garden, what is good for your garden, and how can you do it. I sent Sarah some publications and the presentation so she can forward it to you all. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to try to go through all of it, but likely I won't cover everything that could be covered. And in those publications, there is more details about how to do the composting and how to interpret an analysis or what you're looking in analysis to know the quality of the compost if you buy one, if you purchase some, or when you do it yourself. You want to know what is how good it is. And maybe next time improve if there is something that is not quite right. Anyway, we're going to talk about compost then. And the first things, before getting into the compost itself, we want to know what is soil and how can compost help in the soil. And if we understand what soil is, or what it's used for, and what it needs to be very good soil for growing plants, you need to understand that the soil is a live and dynamic system. It's composed by of minerals, organic matter, and that's what compost is going to be related to, organic matter, water, air, and microorganisms. And here is where I want to emphasize the relationship between organic matter and microorganisms, because it actually, organic matter is what sustains the microorganisms. If there is no organic matter, living organisms are unlikely to be in the soil, or a very, very small amount. So essentially organic matter is, well, the soil is support plant and tree life by providing them with nutrients and water. And organic matter plays a role in there by releasing nutrients from itself, from the organic matter that comes from plant residues or animal residues. But the soil is, as I mentioned, composed by solids and minerals, about 50% of it. The other 50% usually spores. But in the solids and minerals, it could be a lot or little organic matter that it could go from 0.5% to actually 50%. There are soils that are called muck soils. There are many in Michigan and in Florida that are practically only organic matter, those soils. So there's very little solid material except organic matter. But most of the soil here in Missouri are mostly mineral with a 1 to 2% organic matter, unless you add compost and organic matter that you can increase the amount of organic matter 5, 10% of the soil, and that is a good amount. Yeah. As I said, the pores is about 50%, and from the pores, about air would be about 20 to 30%, and water would be between 10 and 20%. All this air and water varies according to how saturated is the soil after rain or after irrigation, in comparison to when the plants have already sucked up the water and there's little water left. But that's what soil is. And remember, we're going to talk about organic matter to get into compost. So what is organic matter? Organic matter is the breakdown of plants and animal residue. So it's dead tissue. In the soil, it retains moisture. One of the main characteristics or the main uses of organic matter in the soil is to retain moisture. It also increases plant water, available water. Improves soil fertility because it's adding, when you add organic matter or compost, you're adding certain amount of nutrients depending on the concentration in that organic matter. not all organic matter and not all compost are the same. So we're going to go through that later on, but we want to understand that not everything is the same. One of the other main things of organic matter is that improves soil structures and reduce erosions. You see that picture below, what a heavy rain can do in a field if it doesn't have much organic matter in comparison to the other field where there is quite a bit of organic matter because there is a no-till field there. So when you don't till the soil, the organic matter, the residue of the plants that you have there can increase the amount of organic matter. And the organic matter act as a glue of the soil particles. So you tie them together and it's more difficult for the rain to run off and take it with it. As you see in the top picture, one of those crumbs has practically no organic matter and the other one has plenty of organic matter. Normally, if you press those two particles, those two crumbs, the one that does not have organic matter will break down pretty easily into smaller pieces. The one that has organic matter, because of the glue, it will stay together more firm in the soil or in your hand. And as I mentioned before, also organic matter is food to sustain soil microorganisms. And that activates not only the degradation of organic matter, but the release of nutrients for your plants. So that's the importance of organic matter and what it is. And that's why we use compost to improve the amount of organic matter in the soil. So what is compost then? It's a dark brown powdery material with earthy aroma. That's a good feeling or a good indicator of a good compost. As any organic matter, it consists primarily of decomposed plant and animal residues. And the decomposition is caused by thermophilic microorganisms and the increased temperature. And I want to emphasize this. What is the difference between compost and decomposed organic matter? The big difference is the temperature at which they were decomposed. And that makes a big difference, as we're going to see later on. The compost must have gone through a higher temperature during decomposition, and that temperature is important to kill certain pathogens. Yeah, and this is also important in food safety for farmers that use compost or use manure. It is important to follow the food safety rules to do compost to avoid the risk of contamination with human pathogens. So that's the big difference between let the plant material decompose by itself or actively using conditions to increase the temperature and kill not only human pathogens, but also plant diseases, plant pathogens. You can make the compost at home, or you can buy it in the store. At home, you can use grass clippings and other garden refuse, or, for example, with hay or straw mixed with manure. Yeah. The compost, as I mentioned, will add nutrients to the soil, but it is considered mostly as a soil amendment to increase organic matter. But it's not used as a fertilizer, but it does provide nutrients, include nutrients in the soil that plants can use. But it's mainly added as an organic matter to improve soil characteristics. It's also used as mulch, potting material or potting soil, and media for seedlings. Yeah, there are all those types. There are different qualities of compost. If the compost is too coarse, of course, it's not going to be good for seedlings, for media for seedlings. but it can be used for potting or mulching. So what is the compost process? And this is a publication in there. I gave this publication to Sarah so she can forward it to you, and you're going to find a lot more information in there. But in general, compost is a fast decomposition of organic matter by thermophilic microorganism, which means it has to heat up to 140, 160 degrees. That's the big difference between compost and decomposed plant material. If you add more nitrogen, it promotes faster decompositions and it may increase the temperature of the pile. So nitrogen, and we're going to talk about the relationship between nitrogen and carbon or plant material, essentially plant material. So one of the things is the decomposition of organic matter by thermophilic microorganisms, and it needs to heat up to 140, 160 degrees. And this is to destroy most pathogens and weed seeds. Although those temperatures will not kill every soil-borne disease, that's why it's important. We're going to talk later on to avoid certain plant material. Mm-hmm. There's an echo there. Probably somebody has opened. Yeah. So it's important that they reach those temperatures to destroy most pathogens, but have in mind that not all soil pathogens will die. The compost, because of the amount of organic matter, is kind of acidic initially, but over time, that acidity will change into basicity or alkalinity. That means the pH is going to increase. And here you have to be very careful, and we recommend to submit a sample of the compost to a lab, because if the pH is too high, it might affect the availability of micronutrients, and plants cannot uptake macronutrients at very high pH above 7.5. So you want to know what the pH of the compost is to be able to manage it or amend it to reduce that pH. Normally, when the pH of a soil or compost it gets above 7.5, we recommend it to mix it with sulfur, but the amount of sulfur is very critical. So it's better to submit a sample, and the lab will suggest the amount of sulfur to add to reduce the pH. If you put too much sulfur, the pH will go way down, and that's not good either. So pH acidic initially, but then increases with maturity, and you want to test to keep it in the right pH range. Things that we don't consider compost: H manure. If there is no temperature involved, H manure or is not compost, it's just H manure. Grass clippings or leaves and other organic residue left to decompose without reaching the necessary temperature are not compost. So that's the big difference between decomposition and compost, the temperature that it needs to be reached to kill most of the pathogens and microorganisms that are not only risky for human, but also for the plant. A few warnings. I've been talking about a few things about food safety. So human pathogens in the food safety rules, when you do or farmers do composting, they are required to monitor the pile, and it has to reach 131 degrees for several days. So this is important to follow also at the home garden if you're going to do your own compost, at least 131. But that temperature does not kill many microorganisms or plant pathogens. So you want to reach higher temperature than that, and we're going to go through that. So the food safety does not allow leftovers from restaurants and stores either. because leftover may have been touched or put in the mouth by people that you don't know, that people that could have been sick. So the food safety rules does not allow to use food leftover. And also the food safety rules requires to keep the pile that has been properly composted, keep it from recontamination. That means you don't want animals to get close to it that could poop or step on it from bringing other non-treated material into the compost. So those are the rules from the food safety point of view that it would be good to follow you. You may have a pet at home. You don't want the pet to poop in the compost pile. Essentially, because if you use this compost in your garden, in your vegetable garden, you're increasing the risk that that vegetable may become contaminated with feces or compost that it has been contaminated with human illnesses, human diseases. So it's important to keep the pile separated away from animals or covered and protected from animals. Even from birds, if birds poop and the poop fall on top of the pile, is recontaminating that pile. Another thing that you have to be very careful, and we're going to talk in more detail, but is the source of materials. Nowadays, we've been having a lot of troubles that people make compost out of hay or out of manure from cattle that have been fed with in pasture or with hay that has been treated with herbicides. Nowadays, there are some herbicides that are very stable and they can last for many years. And if those herbicides are used those contaminated materials with herbicide are used in the compost pile, whether as manure or as hay or other ways, that herbicide will stay, it won't be destroyed by the compost, and then you're going to put it in your garden and your plants are going to be affected by those herbicides. And now I'm going to show you some pictures later on, but this is very common. Even I had to go and see a cattle farmer. Yeah, actually I saw their wife. Her vegetable garden was full of symptoms from the herbicide. And I had to tell her that she has to complain to her husband because the manure that they were using from the cattle production was contaminated. And that was the result of these symptomatic vegetable plants. So you have to be very aware of what's the source of material. Yeah. Also, you have to be aware that some of these materials may have heavy metal or solids. You don't want to have solids, metal, glass, etc. in your compost. If you're managing your compost with your hands and you have glass in there, likely you're going to get a cut or something. So you have to be very careful on that. Lime increases the pH and is used to increase pH as an amendment in soil to increase pH. But if you use it in the compost, the pH of the compost may become too high and it will make the ammonia to volatilize. So you will be losing nitrogen in your compost. So in the compost, it's not much recommended to use lime. The most you use sulfur to reduce the pH, but likely you won't need lime in the compost. The other thing that I'm going to talk more in detail is diseased plants, particularly plants that have soil-borne diseases that are being infected with soil-borne diseases. You don't want to recycle those plants, not to the soil, not to the compost pile, because a lot of the soil-borne diseases can handle very high temperatures, so you won't be able to kill them at the temperature that the compost pile reaches. So you don't want to recycle those diseases You want to get rid of those plants and burn them instead of putting it back in the soil or back into the compost. Avoid the recycling of those pathogens. Other things that if you use too much compost, you may have imbalances in the nutrient. Sometimes it can happen, but the imbalances can be fixed, and that's why it's important to have a soil as well as compost test at the lab, so you will know where you're at, and amendments can be applied, can be done. When in doubt, as I mentioned, send a sample to the lab and you will understand better what to do to fix the problem. Yeah. And consult us, consult the extension specialist. I'm available, not for long, but I'm still available. But somebody will replace me later, so there's always going to be somebody available. What else? Progressive composting process. So composting needs time, depending on the conditions. So conditions are like a moisture in the pile, the carbon to nitrogen, C2N is carbon to nitrogen, aeration, temperatures, and the amount of turning will affect, those are the conditions that will affect the timing as well as the quality of the compost. Yeah. The timing is important. You're going to need 3 to 8 weeks, depending on these conditions, for the compost to fully be ready for maturation, and then a little more time for maturation. Yeah, microorganisms need air and water to act. If the pile is too dry, those microorganisms are not going to be able to work as they should. And also microorganisms are dependent on pH, as I mentioned pH before. Not just plants, but microorganisms are also affected by a higher pH or very low pH. So it's important to have the right pH for microorganisms to act. High pH and moisture and oxygen or aeration. Yeah, and when the temperature increases, that's when I'm talking about thermophilic microorganisms, those that can withstand higher temperatures. Mm-hmm. So, and also when you have a pile, normally the temperature increases in the center of the pile, but not in the outside. But you want the outside also to be high in temperature to be decomposed by this thermophilic microorganism. So you need to turn it over and put the outside layers in the center of the pile to be able to be decomposed by these thermophilic microorganism and to reach the temperatures necessary to kill the problems. So you need to turn it and mix the compost, but mainly look into putting the outside area or layers into the center of the pile. And you do this turning 3 or 4 times during the composting process. As I mentioned before already, for food safety, you win 131 degrees for 3 days and turn it, repeat it 3 times. But to kill plant diseases and weeds, you want to go up to 140 to 180. 180 degrees is very difficult to reach. Most likely you're going to get 140, 160. But 180 will kill more diseases. But if you don't get there, well, hopefully you can get 140, 160. But be aware that the higher temperature, those microorganisms that you won't be able to kill, you don't want to put them in the pile in the first place by looking, only put plant material that is being relatively healthy, not with soil-borne diseases. And I'm going to show you a few examples on that. So avoid using meat, fats, bones, cooked meals. I mean, you could put a little bit, but the problem is that these will make the process too slow and it will stink. These will attract unwanted visitors. You don't want the pile, the compost to be very have off odors. You want an earthy odor, not a bad odor in your garden. And as I avoid adding mature weeds with full of seeds. There are some seeds, some weeds that the seeds are pretty tough on high temperatures also. So you don't want to add weeds that have already seeds, mature seeds in it. When the weeds are fresh, young, you can use it thinking that they're like any other plant, but avoid to add the seeds from the weeds. I mean, as I mentioned before, some seeds are very resistant to temperature. And as I mentioned before, avoid diseased plants, especially plants with roots or stem rots or wilts. And I'll show you a couple pictures later on. When we talk about carbon to nitrogen ratio, here there is a table with different carbon to nitrogen ratio depending on the organic material, the origin of the organic material, like pig manure, poultry manure, cow manure, etc. And you can see that there is some materials that have very high carbon to nitrogen. I mean, it's very low in nitrogen and a lot of carbon. But there are other materials that are much higher in nitrogen, so they have a very low ratio carbon to nitrogen. So essentially, the idea is for you to mix several of these type of material to reach a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 30 to 1 or 35 to 1 to begin the process. Yeah, just to begin the process. After you finish the compost, the ratio of carbon to nitrogen should be between 10 to 1 to 20 to 1. That would be the ideal. Yeah, but to get to that ratio, you have to start with a ratio of 30 to 1. So you can use some plant material, for example, cow manure, you add a little bit of straw, and you calculate the relationship to get to a 30 to 1 relationship. If you use pig manure, that's a much higher nitrogen content, so you will have to add less manure in relationship to straw, or grass clipping is a good level by itself, but or vegetable waste, etc. Some people can use bark and paper. And in the publication that I mentioned before, on that one down there in the bottom part, there are some more examples of organic matter with different carbon to nitrogen ratio that you can use. Yeah. One thing you have to be careful, a high carbon nitrogen ratio means the process is not finished. At the end of the process, if it's still too high, it may not have finished yet. There's still more carbon to be burned or not burned, transformed or chewed up by the microorganisms. So if you add a high carbon to nitrogen ratio compost to the soil, it most likely will fix the nitrogen in the soil. Those microorganisms are going to use it, and that nitrogen is going to be less available for the plants that you're putting the compost to. So it's very important that you calculate the amount of the ratio and to test so you can know what's the final product, the quality of the carbon to nitrogen ratio is. And depending on that, you can adjust with fertilizer or with more plant material that would increase the ratio if the carbon is not enough. So it can be adjusted with nitrogen fertilizer, manures, or plant residue. When the carbon to nitrogen is too high, you have to add material that has much lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, so you can reach the right amount, the right ratio that is recommended. How to make the compost? Yeah, usually you can make a heap or use a container like this picture showing there. You can have a cinder blocks around it. You can make it with wood, make from pallets or other sources. You can make it with a wire, a mesh or screen. A lot of people use those. Or you can have, if you have a barrel or tumble barrel, there are commercial composters like that one in the bottom. Any way you want it. The cheapest way is just to put in a pile, but normally when you put in an open pile, the outside layer does not get the temperature, and you're probably gonna need more turning than if you have it in a container, container structure like those other ones. One of the things that you have to have if you build a container structure is that it has to have areas where air can get in. There has to be air exchange. Remember that the microorganisms that are decomposing the material need oxygen, need aeration and moisture. So you don't want to be completely tight. It has to be some aeration, air movement inside. Yeah. Another thing is that you can, when you have a structure, is you want the right amount of moisture. You don't want excess of moisture. So if you notice that the moisture is good, you want to put probably a cover, a plastic cover, so rain won't increase the amount of moisture or the amount of water. If it's too dry, you might want to water it to increase the moisture. And normally, when you build the pile, you're going to notice if the materials are too dry or too wet. And if it's too wet, you might want to, as you build different layers, you want to sprinkle some water to increase the moisture. Again, we need moisture, moist pile, not a wet pile, moist pile, so microorganisms can work the way they're supposed to. So place with good air circulation and access to water. Layer dried and fresh material to keep a carbon nitrogen ratio of 30:1. Fertilizer after each layer only if you're not going to use manure. If you're using manure with high amount of nitrogen, you don't need to add fertilizer. But you need to calculate the right amount, concentration, or carbon to nitrogen ratio. Include layers of soil or mature compost from previous compost pile to add the microorganisms that they're going to do the job. If you add the microorganism, the decomposition is going to start faster. Remember to lightly water the pile as you build it, and every 3 days to turn it, every 3 days to allow aeration, as well as bringing the outside layers inside to get the temperature and the decomposing activity. Understand that the pile will shrink 50% or more after it's fully mature, because the decomposition is chewing up some of the organic matter. So the microorganisms are eating the organic matter. The pile will shrink, and it will be ready when it's dark and brown and very fine, crumbly, and has an earthy smell. Yeah, that is very important to characterize a good quality compost. If it has off odors, likely you still have animal residue there that are stinging, or when it's too wet and the composition is not permitted by the right microorganism, that means it's being decomposed by anaerobic microorganisms. It's gonna release off odors. You don't want that. You wanna, if that's going on, you wanna turn it and aerate it to increase the activities of the thermophilic aerobic microorganisms. And don't forget to send a sample to the soil lab to understand or to know where you're at. Composted mature and herbicide residues. I mentioned before the problem with the herbicides in the compost or in the plant material or manure that you're using to make your compost. These two particularly and other herbicides, but these are two very, very important. Grazon that is used in pasture and dicamba is used in wheat and other crops, that the residue of the crop like hay or straw can be used to make compost, but these materials are going to have these compounds in it, and these are very stable. They're used to kill broadleaf weeds, so the weed killers. And if you're going to have in your garden broadleaf like lettuce, tomatoes, beans, because these herbicides are designed to kill broadleaf, is going to affect your plant. So you want to make sure that you have material that is free from these contaminants. And as I mentioned before, they're very stable and then can persist 3 to 5 years or longer in the soil or in the manure. I had a grower that bought a compost and it lasted 3 years in his greenhouse. He put it in the greenhouse soil to improve the soil, but he had the problem for 3 years that the plants were showing symptoms. So you have to, if you're going to purchase anything, compost or hay or any manure or anything, you want to talk to the buyer and make sure they can guarantee you that it's not contaminated. Yeah, if they can guarantee that, won't guarantee you that in writing, better. I don't know if they're going to do it, but if you can ask them to do it, do it. The person, so the person you're getting the manure hair from, you may not know what was applied to that hay or fed to livestock, but you want to find out, or they should be finding out where they're getting the material. If you buy something that is in doubt, you can use a bioassay. The two most sensitive crop to these particular herbicides is green beans and tomatoes. So you can pick a little bit of this material compost and seed it with green beans or tomatoes. Green bean is faster than tomatoes. And if they don't germinate, or if they germinate and showing symptoms, twisting and not right, they don't look well, we'll see a couple pictures later, then you want to avoid that compost or that material. That means it's likely to be contaminated with herbicide. Here you have some tomatoes, and you can see grown tomato that it was affected by a drift of these herbicides. So the bottom leaves are in good shape, but the newer leaves in the top are affected and showing distortions because of the herbicide drift. In the other picture, the seedlings in the tray, those are from the media. The media was mixed with compost that was contaminated, and that's what the result of these tomato plants look like. Yeah. If you use this compost media in a pot and the transplant is in good shape and you put it in a pot, the plant is going to grow and start to show the symptoms after a week or so. In a week or 2 weeks, they're going to be clearly showing symptoms of this effect. So this is what happens when you use contaminated compost or plant material or manure with your plants. Mm-hmm. So you have to be very careful with this situation. Here are some examples of plant pathogens. When what I was saying, some pathogens can be killed with lower temperatures, but there are some pathogens that require high temperatures to be killed. And even though I'm going to show you in the next picture. Some of these pathogens, like Fusarium or some Sclerotinia, they produce certain resistant structures that we call a survival structure that can be very resistant to high temperature, and they will survive the compost or certain temperatures during the compost. So if you only get 140 degrees or 150 degrees, you're gonna kill some of the problems in your compost pile or in your garden, but you may not be able to kill these other ones. So the higher the temperature that you can reach, the better. But to avoid these problems, plant pathogenic bacteria, Fusarium, Sclerotinia, you want to avoid adding plants that have been killed or show symptom of these diseases. Yeah, it's very important to have this concept. And here you have, for example, I mentioned that from the food safety point of view, human diseases, 131 degrees would be enough to kill those ones. But that is not enough for plant pathogenic microorganisms. One of the things on the plant soil-borne diseases, you have to understand first thing, what is parasitic and what is saprophytic. Parasitics, like the picture in the right, are organisms that attack the plant. And they may live with it, but they might kill it, but they produce disease symptoms and disease problems to the plant. A saprophytic microorganism does not infect the plant, but it does live out of organic matter, as you see in the left picture. So these organisms might contaminate your compost pile because compost is organic matter. So that's why you want to maintain your organic matter, your compost, cover after you finish, cover to avoid more contamination. Normally, these saprophytic organisms appears in areas that are damp and shady. Yeah. So you want to keep once your pile, the compost pile is finished, you don't want it to be very wet or dry or very dry. Well, if it's dry, that's fine. It already finished, but it should be moist during the composting process. After that, it can be dried out a little bit, but you don't want it wet or damp because of microorganisms that take advantage, saprophytic organisms that are gonna chew up your compost pile. And as I mentioned before, you don't want to add these plants that have been infected with parasitic microorganisms because some of them will withstand the high temperature. In this particular picture, it's not very clear, but in the cat here, the stem cat, the vascular system or the wood inside in the center is dark. That's a good way to find out if the plant is being affected by this disease when it's wilted or not. You cut at the crown, at the stem and base, and if the inside is dark, necrotic, it means that it's been infected with some soil-borne diseases. You don't want that plant to be incorporated in the pile or in the soil. You gotta burn that plant. Here are examples of bacteria wilting and dieback or tumor-like galls in fruit trees. There's a lot of this tumor-like in the right bottom picture. And the top one is a tomato with a bacterial wilt. The other picture on the left is in melons with a different bacterial wilt. All these are soil-borne, so you don't want to use these plants that are wilting or has this tumor in the stockpile or not even reincorporated into the soil. You want to burn this plant material. Here are some other one, Verticillium and Fusarium. This is a shrub, they wilt this part of the plant, this is a tree, but they also attack tomatoes and vegetables. So you want to make sure that your plant is not affected. And you're again going to see that the vascular system, you see this gut is necrotic inside, and the wood is also showing necrotic symptoms, dark tissue. This is clear symptoms of infection. You do not want to use this material in your compost pile or in the soil. You gotta burn this plant material. Here's your tomatoes and peppers and lettuce. You see in the top picture, you see that's a Sclerotium rothschildii. All this white material is the mycelia attacking the plant. I produce this light brown, we call that sclerotia. That is a structure, that's the structure, the survival structure of the organism. And that survival structure is very resistant to temperature. So you don't want to incorporate this. If you see those, you want to burn and not incorporate it in the soil or in the compost pile. In the bottom left, you have that red circle also. It shows inside I already cut this. This is a pepper, but it also happened in tomato and also happened in lettuce. It's the same thing. This lettuce will, the same thing. The organism is a sclerotinia, that is the white rot or white mold timber rot in tomato, form this black structure in the pith of the stem. That black structure is the inoculum that will survive the composting process. And if it goes back to the soil, it will produce spores that will infect your plant next year. So you want, when you see these plants that have been dead, you want to pull it out and burn it. Do not incorporate it in the soil or in the compost pile. Same this other one. This one doesn't have sclerotia. It's Rhizoctonia, but the same thing. Rhizoctonia dies at a lower temperature, but you don't want to reincorporate this plant in the pile. Same with these lettuce or the soil. You want to burn these plants. So I think, yeah, composting problems, yes. So we already talked about the diseases, and we talk about the things already. Bad odor, that means it's too wet, or too tight, that means not much air, or animal products, too much animal products. So you need to loosen the pile and add a dry material to reduce the wetness. Yeah. You can do it as you turn the pile. You can add this dry material. And as you turn the pile, make sure that those tight areas get loosened up to allow air for the microorganisms to work. If there is no decomposition, it means that it's too dry, and you want to moisten as you turn. You lightly water it to increase moisture as you turn the pile. If it's not hot enough, that means the pile is too small, so the outside temperatures, maybe in the winter, are cooling it off. Or this carbon to nitrogen ratio is high. There's not enough nitrogen for the microorganisms to grow and be active and increase the temperature. So if it's a small pile, you want to make it larger by adding more material. And if the carbon nitrogen is too high, you want to add nitrogen, whether with manure or grass clipping or fertilizer, while you turn the pile. That will increase the reduce the carbon to nitrogen ratio to the right amount. Sometimes there is incomplete decomposed material, so large pieces, twig, woods, etc. You want to remove those and screen them out. You can use a screen to collect only the small particles, and the largest particles can be put back into a new compost pile. Not only is going to add the microorganisms, but it's going to have more time to become decomposed into smaller pieces. sometimes you don't get to use the compost for in a long time. You want to understand that the longer you wait, you might lose nitrogen in that pile by leaching or volatilization. So it's not bad. It's still going to have some nutrients, but you're going to be losing some of the nitrogen. But it's still good for as a good soil amendment anyway. But you don't want to lose much of the nutrients. So you want to use it as soon as possible after maturing. Yeah. But if you can't, not big deal. But understand that you're going to lose some of the nutrients. I mentioned some of the uses already, but in general, the uses of the compost is as a soil amendment to improve soil characteristics, soil moisture, fertility, and soil structure, etc. Should be added annually in the fall or the spring while you till the soil. You can use it as a potting material for houseplants. Use the good quality, not the very coarse material, well, or medium coarse for potting plants. But if you use it as a seed starting seeds in a tray, you do want to use the material, the fine material, and sometimes it's recommended to mix it with a perlite to avoid compaction and to avoid excess of water. Yeah. So if you mix it with a perlite, it would improve the quality. When you buy a seedling material, soilless media in the store, usually it comes with perlite that helps aeration and not to accumulate too much water. You can add it in your garden when you plant your annuals or perennials. You can use it as mulching. Usually the coarser material is used as mulching. You can use it as a top dressing around the plant if you want to use it as a fertilizer. But as I said, it's not a whole lot of fertilizer that you can add. But if you add it constantly, annually, and you keep a good percentage of organic matter, you may not need fertilizer. If the organic matter is above 5% in your soil, we usually do not recommend nitrogen. We might recommend other nutrients, but normally not nitrogen because the organic matter is releasing enough nitrogen. And not only is releasing it, it's a slow release method. Organic matter releases nitrogen slowly over time. So that is a good thing for plants. It's not when you add fertilizer, you're giving it a shot, a one-time shot. Organic matter releases it over time, which is better for the plant. It uptakes it slowly over time as it grows. So you can use it as a top dressing around plants. You can use it as a top dressing in lawns too, but with very fine particles, but no more than a 1/4 inch thick. Otherwise, it will suffocate your lawn. So very thin layer of compost in your lawn. And with this, we finish this presentation. And if you have any question, any questions so far? No questions?
Yeah, I don't see any, Ramon. Kaden had wrote in the comments, we bring in trailer loads of wood chips and mix it with our hay and cow manure.
Uh-huh. Well, that's good. The chipper is going to take a little longer to decompose normally, but in the long run, term, yes, it will decompose. And that's good because wood chips are very low in nitrogen, so mixing it with manure is an excellent choice. You can use it even if it's still high pieces, you can use it as a mulch layer. And a lot of landscapers use it that way. You go see landscaper, usually the compost that they put on top is very chunky, very coarse. Any other question?
Kaden just said it's around 100 feet long row.
Mm-hmm. So they're professional, huh? That's good. Do they sell it or is just for themselves?
I'm not for sure. I think Kaden had said last time maybe that he worked for a greenhouse.
Say it again.
Yeah. Yeah. Last time Kaden had mentioned that he works for a greenhouse.
That I what? I
A
went to
green
her green?
Works for a greenhouse.
Oh, okay, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
But Ramon, I think
Okay,
that's all we have.
well, I appreciate you all participating, and if you have more questions, just shoot an email.
Sounds good.
Appreciate
Thank you all
you.
so much.